Hello, my name is Anna LaRue, and today I will be talking about gene patenting. In this PowerPoint, my goal is to provide information on what gene patenting is and the consequences that stem from it. I will be discussing the history of gene patenting and important research and cases that have led to the current status of this topic. So first off, I would like to address what gene patenting is. Gene patenting can be described as gene patents allows unique segments of DNA, which perhaps code for a certain disease or a certain protein, to be solely owned by an individual or corporation. This leads to two really important questions about gene patenting. First, from the legal aspect. So legally, should human genes be considered products of nature? The second pertains more to policy and ethics. How will the gene patent system affect the public, and how is it regulated? There is a lot of controversy that surrounds this topic. Issues of ethics, science, law, and many others have been brought up from the concept of gene patenting. In 2013, a very crucial Supreme Court case occurred that was called Molecular Pathology versus Myriad Genetics Incorporated, and ruled that since genes are a part of nature, it is therefore unconstitutional to patent them. There is, however, a bit of a loophole with the ruling. The Supreme Court did rule that it is unconstitutional for DNA to be patented. However, synthetic DNA or cDNA that's manipulated from its original state is fair game to be patented. So there is more issues and controversy that surrounds that. Here is a little bit of a picture. It's kind of like a political cartoon that shows the genetics lab and the idea of genetic patents and the issue of money and corruption that surround it. And now, I wanted to introduce my thesis for this paper and project. So my thesis remains that gene products should remain unconstitutional. And throughout the PowerPoint, I will provide reasoning to support this claim. So here is going to be a bit of a brief history of genetic patenting and a timeline of important events throughout history. So the patent system is actually over 400 years old. It started with, in the 1700s, the U.S. Patent Act was passed, and it essentially stated that products, things, items, anything essentially can be patented. This is important because it ultimately plays a role in the issues of gene patenting today. Although in the 1700s, they weren't talking about genetic patenting because science and technology was not adequately prepared to do so. It does matter in today's standards because since the U.S. Patent Act of 1790 was passed, it does create more discrepancy for issues like in the Supreme Court case of how to go about genetic patenting. In the 1900s, an important event happened in 1906, and that was the first patent for a human product was granted on March 20th, 1906 for a purified form of adrenaline. It was challenged and upheld in a court that natural substances, when they are purified, are more useful than the original or natural substances. And that kind of led to what happened later in the 80s. The first patent on a recombinant DNA method was granted in December of 1980, only 6 months after the Supreme Court had ruled in Diamond versus Chakrabarty that life form could be patented. So this was a really crucial time for gene patenting because it really set the precedent of what the future research would entail. The patent, who at the time was shared by Stanford and USC, basically laid the groundwork for using cells to produce important proteins for valuable drugs and treatments. Gene patents were also an extension of legal doctrines that permitted patents on hormones, vaccines, and other natural products. And then we get to the 1990s, where more rules and regulations began to be enforced, and the controversy of the topic started to rise, and it got a little more heated because there was more issues of things like ethics and monopolies, and things that were brought to the attention of individuals that were concerning in terms of genetic patenting. And then in the 2010s, that is when the Supreme Court case happened that was extremely influential for what would happen in the future of gene patenting. So now I would like to discuss, why is gene patenting done in the first place? So there are quite a few reasons on why gene patenting is done. And some of those include, one being to provide insight to why our bodies get gene-linked diseases. And this is done through what we call genetic testing. One of the most popular genetic testing pertains to the BCR-A1 gene and the BCR-A2 gene. And these are genes that affect the risk of cancer. Mutations in the BRCA1 and the BRCA2 account for an estimated of 5 to 10% of breast cancer, as well as significantly elevated risks of ovarian cancer and other cancers. A gene mutation is something that's really important when looking in genetic studies, and a gene mutation is described as a permanent alteration in the DNA sequence that makes up a gene, such that the sequence differs from what is found in most people. So this is how things like cancers and other genetic diseases happen. An organization called Autism Speaks provides a lot of information and resources, and has really allocated a lot of their time to studying autism and providing resources for individuals and families that have autism. And according to the Autism Speaks website and a recent study conducted by the organization, 18 new autism-linked genes have been detected. In 2018, a study concluded that 99 genes could play a role in the disorder, with 65 of those genes already identified. So here we can really see the astounding weight on the study of genetics, and we can for understanding more of diseases and disorders. And now, if these genes were patented, the research most likely would not have been as successful and conducted in the same way, because one corporation would have the sole rights to those genes and could control how research was done, who was allowed to access it, and what they wanted to do with said treatment. It can also be used for body identification, for forensic evidence, and research to cures and drugs. Those are for gene patenting often argue that this is the most crucial aspect of doing it in terms of researching cures to things like cancer. Many also would argue that it boosts competition to find cures. So in 2013, this Supreme Court case happened, and this really was important for gene patenting and for why it was unconstitutional, and helps with my thesis of why it should remain unconstitutional. So the case is Molecular Pathology versus Myriad Genetics. And essentially what the case was challenging was the validity of gene patents in the United States, specifically challenging certain claims in issued patents that were owned by the Myriad Genetics Corporation that covered isolated DNA sequences. The hearing took place in New York. Prior to the case, the U.S. Patent Office accepted patents on isolated DNA sequences, and more than 4,300 genes were patented. Those in favor argued that patents would encourage investments in biotechnology and innovation in genetic research. Those opposed argued that patents would stifle innovation by preventing others from conducting cancer research. It would limit options for cancer patients in seeking genetic testing, and that the patents are not valid because they relate to genetic information that is not inventive, but rather produced from something that occurs naturally. So Myriad Genetics did try to appeal the court decision, and it was determined that isolated, or the synthetic DNA, since it does not occur in naturally, that is what is allowed to be patented. This was a really important ruling because it brought to the attention that things that occur naturally do not have the right to be patented for a profit. So it protects the public from genes being monopolized and would create a unfair source of treatment and how people could afford getting it and obtaining it. And it also protects individuals from having their DNA essentially stolen. So here I have some charts that kind of break down what happened with the Supreme Court case, and it especially highlights issues of money, which is one of the biggest concerns, is that if genes are allowed to be patented, it will monopolize the industry and turn into finding treatments for profit rather than for the well-being of society. So in this chart, we see how on the bottom we have the years from 1993 to 2011, and then on the y-axis it has money in millions. And the chart reads, Utah-based Myriad Genetics generated more than $400 million in revenue from genetic testing in 2011, more than a 700-fold increase from 1993. Medical associations, doctors, and patients have sued the company over what they contend are invalid patents on genes related to breast and ovarian cancer. So as you can see, the chart does take quite an increase, and this highlights a definite issue when it comes to gene patenting. This is a bit of a timeline that kind of highlights what I talked about with the history of gene patenting. So as you can see, a lot of this really occurred not that long ago, and it's still relatively new, which is why there's so much controversy and issues with gene patenting. So as you can see on the graph, in the early 1980s is when the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office begins to issue patents on human genes. And then throughout the 90s and the early 2000s, you can see how things progress, and it becomes more of an issue of legality. And then in 2013 is when the Supreme Court case rules that human DNA is unpatentable. Here we have a graph that in the dark blue signal the expired gene patents, and the blue that are active gene patents. And this is because of the genes that are taken from their natural state and isolated, making them cDNA, which qualifies them for gene patenting. So this is a bit of a scary graph because it's showing that things are being patented, which makes them more susceptible for the industry to become monopolized. So then we get into issues of ethics. One of the main arguments the patenting of genes surrounds are issues of ethics. So there are two significant cases throughout history that exemplify the danger patents can cause because of gene exploitation. Henrietta Lacks, who is photographed on the left, was an African-American woman who in the 1950s was taken advantage of because of her unique cells. Her cells were taken without her consent and in studying cures for cervical cancer. Lacks nor her family ever received monetary compensation, and her race, gender, social status were used against her in order to make the taking of her cells for a profit easier. Another historical case was of John Moore, who is pictured on the right. John Moore gave his swollen spleen in order to help with treatments for leukemia. However, the doctor, the hospital, and biotech company took his cells without his knowledge to create and sell a product. From these two cases, the ethical and moral issue is brought to us as the audience, showing how this type of patenting can be extremely dangerous. This is an issue of ethics because corporations or companies with money can ultimately take advantage of patients for their own benefit. Anyone can be affected by this, which is why it's so important, but especially those of minorities and those who come from lower socioeconomic classes. They simply cannot compete with the power and control of some of these medical entities. In the Lacks case, her cells are known today as HeLa cells and were groundbreaking in the study of cervical cancer. The fact that her cells were not only taken from her without her consent, but also for her to never receive stipulation or accreditation from her cells shows and highlights the issues of ethics and morality. As a society, we should be on high alert of what genetic patenting truly entails and how it could be used in a harmful way rather than a way to advance medical technologies. Another really important issue of gene patenting and why it should continue to remain unconstitutional is the impacts that it will have on patient care. Since patent holders would have the sole rights to genes, they control every aspect of how the gene is used. This means they control what is studied and manufactured and who has the rights to access what is discovered from said genes. It can also compromise the integrity of corporations because since they have total control, there are not ways to verify or stop them from falsifying information to patients for the company's benefits. It also can create higher costs for treatment. Again, if patented, corporations can monopolize the industry and charge whatever they want for drugs and treatments and even cures. This should be alarming to us as a society because of the issues of ethics that I mentioned previously. Corporations alone should not have the right to use genes of the individuals and the cures derived from said genes to just make a profit and deny those who cannot afford it. This would also prevent people from getting potentially life-saving genetic testing, depending on the corporation and how they address the costs and accessibility of testing. So, in summary, these are some of the main consequences of genetic testing. It ultimately hinders research because exclusive patent rights are primarily a tool for companies and research organizations to eliminate their competition. The problem is not with the patents themselves, but rather when overly broad patents are exclusively licensed to a single company or university. Another main consequence is the manipulation of genes. If genes are in the future allowed to be patented, it ultimately sets the precedent that genes, medicine, and the well-being of society can be capitalized on, and those medical corporations have the say in who gets treatment, how much it costs, and how accessible it is depending on your region, your gender, your race, and your socioeconomic class. And lastly, it infringes on our rights. DNA is something that occurs naturally in society. We all have our own DNA, and it should not be used against us to make a profit, especially without our consent, if it was patented, ultimately could happen because the corporations and medical companies would have the right to do so. So in summary, I attached my conclusion from my paragraph, but I wanted to specifically highlight the sentence in yellow. So without the appropriate protection of laws, corporations would be able to patent genes and do whatever they wanted with them and suffer no consequences. It's very important that we not only highlight why gene patenting should remain unconstitutional, but it's also very important that there are laws set into place that back this up. The law plays a very important role in gene patenting because it basically dictates and reinforces ethics in medicine and protects people from being taken advantage of. In my opinion, there should be additional laws put into place that are more concise and do not leave room for interpretation like there is with the cDNA that could ultimately still give corporations the right to patent genes in order to make a profit rather than to benefit society. Thank you very much for listening to this presentation, and I hope that you learned something about gene patenting and can help make informed decisions in the future. Thank you.